So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dharma and Justice Dialogue Series from the Thich Nhat Hanh Program for Engaged Buddhism. My name is Peace Twessagy, and I am the director for the Thich Nhat Hanh Program for Engaged Buddhism, as well as Buddhism and Interreligious Engagement, where students are pursuing graduate degrees here all within Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Today's conversation will be with Thenmozhi Soundararajan and Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad, investigating caste and racial oppression through a Buddhist lens. Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad is visiting professor of Buddhism and Black Studies at Union Theological Seminary and author of Black Buddhists and the Black Radical Tradition, the Practice of Stillness in the Movement for Liberation, which explores distinctive interpretations and practices of Black Buddhist teachers. Thenmozhi Soundararajan is a Dalit American artist, community organizer, technologist, and theorist. Thenmozhi is also a co-founder and the current executive director of the grassroots organization Equality Labs, which investigates how caste oppression functions in India and within the Indian diaspora residing in the United States. Thenmozhi is also the author of The Trauma of Caste, a Dalit Feminist Meditation on survivorship, healing, and abolition. Today's conversation will discuss Buddhism, intergenerational trauma, how the experiences of caste and racial oppression mirror one another, and their indebtedness to Black feminist and abolitionist traditions. Before I hand over the mic, I would also like to say a quick thank you to the communications team who has helped make this event a reality, and also to the ASL interpreters here tonight. So for those of you in Zoom, the Q&A box is open, so feel free to put questions that come to mind during this conversation in the Q&A box if you would like a response from the panelists. Questions easily get lost in the chat, so be sure that any questions you would like to be seen by the panelists are put in the Q&A box. And for those of you in Facebook or on YouTube, we'll do our best to bring in those questions for the panelists to see and respond to as well. There will be time at the end of the conversation in this last portion of the conversation for responses to your questions. And so without further ado, I'd like to pass over the mic. Thank you.
Thank you, Peace. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And thank you also to the ASL interpreters and to our communications team for all of your work, both present and behind the scenes. And Thenmozhi, welcome to Dharma and Justice, to our dialogue. I am really so thrilled to be in your presence, even virtually, and to have this conversation and to talk about so much, including our practices and our lineages, our ancestors, our ways of thinking and being, and also the work that is in front of us and the work you are on the vanguard of in terms of abolishing caste oppression in this country and worldwide. I see your work as global work. And what I would love to ask at the outset is what caste oppression means. You use it in your book. It's a book that I have read, that my students are reading, that has sparked tremendous inquiry on my part. And for our audience today, if you could clarify for us what that term means, that would be a really, I think, solid way for us to start.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Rima. And thank you all for attending. And, I almost, before I even want to get into that question, I just want us to maybe all take a collective breath together so that we're really here, because we're going to get into it today, right? So if you wouldn't mind, Rima, would you take a breath with me?
Oh, absolutely.
All right. Let's go ahead and take a deep inhale and then breathe out. breathing out the rest of the day. We'll take another deep breath in, and as we do, we'll bring an intention that this conversation brings us opening. Breathing in and breathing it out. Thank you for that, Rima.
Thank you, Thenmozhi. Thank you.
So for me, I think what's really important when we talk about caste is that we understand that it's a system of exclusion older than race, and it's not the same, but it is analogous. You know, it has its origins in Hindu scripture from 2000 BC, and it's a social fiction. You know, you had priests that wrote some scriptures that said some people deserve to be at the top and are the most spiritually pure and get the best jobs. And then they graded everybody else in lowering levels of spiritual purity and their position in social hierarchy. So you have Brahmins that are at the top, who are the priests, Kshatriyas, who are the rulers, Vaishyas, who are the merchants, Shudras, who were the peasants. And then outside of that whole caste pyramid were those that were seen as spiritual criminals because they did something in another life. And therefore, their dharma in this life, because of that bad karma, was that they were condemned to be untouchable, spiritually defiling, and given the worst jobs, faced backbreaking labor and punishing violence because that was their punishment. And that's the community that I come from. And we really eschew the term untouchable because it's such an epithet, because it means to touch you is to be spiritually defiled and that you have no worth in the eye of God. And nobody gets to determine that, right? So instead, we choose the term Dalit, which means that which is broken or resilient. Or we change our religion and we go into other faiths, or even just call ourselves human because people do not want that label. And then within the caste system, there are also those who are indigenous or Adivasi. So these are the ways that South Asian society is constructed, and societies that are defined by caste like impact over 1.9 billion people and around the world, and 5.7 South Asian Americans. And it's just punishing, grueling, dehumanizing violence. And this is a big part of why I wrote this book, is that despite, 1 in 5 people in the world living in, a caste system, no one's talking about it. And so I think that when you have such deep silencing around something as violent as caste, there is a particular kind of pain that exists in the bodies of caste oppressed people because we're dehumanized and no one is watching, no one is listening. We have no empathetic witness. So it was my hope with this book that we could create that empathetic witness by connecting caste struggle with other struggles of oppressed peoples, and also understand what are the psychologies that go into constructing a society based on such a methodology of dehumanization. So the book is a very useful tool to both understanding caste and also its animating ideology, which is Brahmanism. The ideology started by the Brahmanisms. And you want to talk about Brahmanism the way that you talk about white supremacy in the construction of anti-Blackness. So these are terms that may be unfamiliar to people who aren't used to thinking about racial and hegemonic constructs outside of North America, but they are necessary vocabularies as if we want to globalize our vision of liberation and loving kindness for all beings.
One thing that's so striking about your book, and I would venture to say, although they're very different books, and I'm not necessarily putting my book on the same level, but it is rife with these beautiful voices of Black Buddhist teachers, which is that approach of loving kindness. And I'll just say a few things that really stand out to me and resonate, which is one reason it seems, and just listening to you now really struck me, for writing this book and also for the vanguard activist work you're doing is this work of healing, of taking on trauma and anguish and taking on the psychological work that you're talking about and the religious foundation, the ways in which certain ideas get reference to divine authority and, take on a certain power, if you will. And I'll just say, one thing that is striking me, and I'll also say this to the audience, which is that your book has opened up so much in terms of my own inquiry around the power of Buddhism and how Buddhism speaks to systemic oppression. But while not comparable, and I don't mean to put the origins of the caste system into the same, let's just say, camp of the origins of white supremacy, there is within, especially Christian thought, a kind of othering. And there have been these two amazing scholars. One is Willie Jennings, who's currently at Yale Divinity School, and one is J. Cameron Carter at Indiana University now. They were formerly at Duke, both of them. And they've written very differently, but they've written about the religious underpinnings of white supremacy, and particularly the structure of Christian thought and how anti-Semitism undergirds that structure of Christian thought, and then how that anti-Semitism during the 15th century was expanded and it was racialized. And so then beginning in the early 19th century or early 18th century, when we started to have more scientific approaches to different bodies, different phenotypes, different hair textures, we started to have these racial hierarchies, but there was this religious undergirding beneath it. And so again, not comparable and not talked about in the same way, but powerful. And there is this background of divine sanction. So when I think about the enduring aspect of white supremacy, that's much of what I think about, is that there's this religious underpinning. And I think you point to it in your book, these clarifying ways that help us also know that we can't just confront it intellectually, right? Or we just can't dismantle systems, that we have to get underneath those systems. We have to take on, as you say, the psychology and the emotional aspect of it. There's some deep investment. And I think your book points to what's enduring about the systems and that investment in the systems, but also how we have to confront it in these other ways, including our social, emotional, psychological, and spiritual ways.
Well, it's really powerful for me because I think the divine sanction component of anti-Blackness and anti-Dalitness is actually one of the hardest things to reckon with, I think, when you're in a Black and Dalit body. And I'm so glad that you mentioned it because one of the surprising things that occurred for me when I wrote this book, because I, like all good theorists, I had this plan and I knew what I wanted to do because I could see the need in the field about people needing to have a basic primer around caste, especially for North Americans who are seeing it in institutions. It's really confusing. And, anytime there's words that aren't in English, people are like, oh my gosh, what is this? So I wanted to make it very, very basic. And bell hooks was like my model in terms of pedagogical praxis, that this was not supposed to be a high theory book that only people in the ivory tower could read. I wanted people's hearts and bodies and minds to engage with it the way that you do with bell hooks work. But I think that the thing that I was surprised by is that I was an intellectual expert of caste before I wrote this book. But I feel like I understood my pain as a survivor of religious abuse and how much divine sanction has impacted my ability to access the divine my whole life after I wrote the book, because I was not able to talk about those moments of pain where I was shunned, and then also integrate that experience so that I could see the cumulative effect of what a lifetime of religious shunning would do to you. Because it's, and it's in small things, like in Christianity, if you think about what it means to have a Black Jesus be turned into a white Jesus, right? Or the divine, support of colonialism and settler colonialism by, the Catholic Church. Already there is a division of who is an appropriate divine body in front of God and who is not. And for me, I think as a Dalit person, I faced religious shunning in multiple different terrains, and my first, because I grew up both Hindu and Christian, and I could not reconcile who I was as a fully realized human being with what was being written about me in Hindu scripture. Sure. And to really break away and be able to claim my own path was a very terrifying thing, because you're walking away from everything that shapes your worldview, but you have to do that to reclaim your dignity, to reclaim your purpose, and your life and your relationship to the divine that can be unmediated. And I'm not the first Dalit to do that. As we talked about, the origins of Buddhism is in socially engaged practice, that Buddhists, Dalit Buddhists, were actually the first socially engaged Buddhists, because Buddhism started as a revolution against brahmanism. So for me, this is such a powerful moment to sit here in my truth as a survivor of religious abuse, but also to claim the lineage of Buddhism as my own. Because even after I wanted to come and really fully be present as a Buddhist, I remember and I wrote about this in my book, I remember having this engagement with this white Buddhist professor who said, oh, you're not really a Buddhist, that you're a fake Buddhist, when I told him I was a Dalit Buddhist. And that comes from, a layer of white supremacy, not even knowing the historical origins of Buddhism. So for us to be having a revolutionary conversation about radical Buddhist practice between Black and a Dalit Buddhist practitioner, this is our ancestors' wildest dreams. Because it represents choice and consent and healing and empathetic witness. Because, I hear the tenderness in the way that you're asking the questions towards me. And I have so rarely felt that, as someone who's Dalit. And I've also, to me, the things that made me so drawn to Black Buddhism was that the writings of Black Buddhists, whether it was your work or Rhonda McGee or Ruth King, or, so many other Black Buddhist practitioners, are about distilling Buddhist practice into such a clear understanding that the suffering that Buddha was talking about wasn't just airy-fairy existential, it was the material pain from structural violence. What does it mean to be jailed? What does it mean to be told that you're inhuman? What does it mean to be hungry? What does it mean to be, the dispossessed? And that you can love yourself and be in beloved community with other people that rehumanize you. And that, when I read Black Buddhists, and that's why I always say, I'm not really of a lineage, but I'm a Buddhist like Alice Walker or Hooks, and Tina Turner, because, yes, that scene where she is fleeing her husband after being heavily beaten up. And then her friend introduces her to the Nichiren Buddhist chant. That rang a bell in my heart when I saw it. And I actually still chant the Nichiren Buddhist chant, from time to time, because I could see it. You need a refuge from dehumanization. You need a way to actually regulate your nervous system in the face of violence. And those are tools that I think oppressed Buddhists offer each other through many lineages of violence, but also many lineages of resilience. And, and I'm curious, Rima, in your own practice, how do you find your Buddhist practice as a refuge in that resort?
I would say that's all it is. It is taking refuge every day, every morning, continuously throughout the day. Yes. So writing the book, writing Black Buddhists, was so formative. I had a practice since 2006. I started off actually in a Soto Zen tradition. I sat for a year and I learned great discipline. And then I encountered loving kindness practice. I went on a BIPOC retreat at the Insight Meditation Society and encountered metta practice, and it was transformative. It was just really astounding how deep it went. And actually, I just carried so much hatred. And of course, underneath that hatred was very deep grief, but I could unpack those layers over years, I would say years. And in my own practice now I'm a parent. I'm on all the time. I have all these limitations in terms of energy and where my attention goes. But every morning I take refuge. And what is so formative for me is tapping into what I would consider like a maternal voice or a divine mother voice. But there's something just very deeply compassionate in how I start my practice each morning. And when you mentioned Ruth King, what I actually echo that, because Ruth in her book, Mindful of Race, has this metta practice, and I've done it with groups for years now, and I do it for myself every morning. And so she has us bring in ancestors to hold our shoulder blades. And if we need to, bring in a younger version of ourselves to offer compassion. And then she just has these beautiful phrases, I will breathe with you. I am here for you. And there's something about showing up for ourselves. I think in my case, get the kids out the door and then sit and just show up and have and offer that refuge and that deep compassion so that whatever comes, I have resources. And my teaching now really does start in that place of compassion, which is resource yourself with compassionate energy. This is what I teach. And then whatever comes your way, you have a safety or a softness. You have a way to receive it so that you don't meet it with a hard edge, and you also don't turn it on yourself so that you actually commit more harm to yourself. And frankly, within Buddhism, the teachings that have been most resonant are these teachings on conditions, thinking about the 12 links. And it starts with ignorance. And I just think, yes, in a collective sense, these conditions do start with ignorance. And then this teaching that we actually, as we adapt to our conditions, we have ways to work with ourselves so that we don't create more harm for ourselves or for those who are closest to us. And so this practice of taking refuge is really that. It's recognizing the conditions, and then it's cultivating ways to meet those conditions so that we don't self-harm, we don't internalize, right, the destructive narratives, the damage, but we can see it clearly and we can give it back. I'm not taking that on, that's yours, but that's not my narrative, or that's your way of thinking, and okay, but I'm not going to take that on, and I'm not going to internalize that. So I do feel so deeply indebted, as you do, to what I would consider, even with multiple lineages, a kind of Black Buddhist tradition that has been just so incredibly powerful. And I feel so grateful to have a place in it now, to be in community. And I do feel a deep sense of community.
No, definitely. And I think that it's not accidental that you have to develop these kinds of tools to address these violent systems, because, no one body has the boundaries and has a container large enough to hold the violence and the surrounding grief and pain that it inflicts on you. And it's funny because I think as scholars and as theorists, we're expected to just work with the mind and just kind of be very cavalier about the impacts to our body and our hearts and our spirits. And certainly, I think that before I started writing this book, I had, 15 to 20 years of organizing as a caste oppressed activist and scholar. I can go toe to toe with anyone around issues related to caste, but I was not aware or integrative of my own experience of my own caste pain, my own caste grief. I think, as violence breaks meaning, I feel like I had basically compartmentalized all of these painful episodes. And so in order to write about all of the domains where caste operates, I had to bring all of those stories, together and reintegrate them. And it's why writing the book was very much like a long sit. I had to think deeply about previous painful episodes and not just skim through the details, but think about what narrative I built or didn't build around it inside of my heart. And I think that the fundamental thing that was so helpful for me was to understand that I have a right to heal. And that
Yes.
healing has to be a part of any discussion related to systems of exclusion, because it's not enough for us to theorize our own demise. It's not fair for BIPOC people and Dalit people to be firefighters and rapid responders for actual structural systemic ills. But in order for us to be in a place to be visionary, we need to be witnessed and we need to be integrated. And so I think for me, the work of thinkers like Rhonda McGee and Ruth King and Resmaa Menakem, who's a Black Somatic abolitionist, and Indigenous healers and social workers and therapists like Maria Braveheart and Eduardo Duran, part of what they really helped me kind of think about was, how do we understand our pain, our wounds from a system of exclusion through that framework that, Eduardo Duran created called the soul wound. And that was such like an aha moment when I was reading those works and thinking about intergenerational harm and caste. Because caste, first of all, has been studied, pretty heavily as a material phenomenon, as a political and social phenomenon. But this book is the first book that talks about caste through the lens of trauma. And not just individual trauma, but structural and intergenerational trauma. And that is a forbidden conversation, because if we have to talk about that, we have to talk about the centuries of violence that has been inflicted on our people, and the theft of our label, the desecration of our spirits and our bodies and our hearts. And that is a reckoning South Asians have been terrified to have. But the soul wound is such a beautiful framework to look at it, because it talks about how bodies of privilege and bodies that are oppressed have trauma related to a soul wound, whether it's racial or gender or caste in nature. And that you need to spend time. Everyone must have a period of self-examination to understand what is your experience of a caste soul wound or a racial soul wound. And are you in a privileged body, or are you in an oppressed body? And what stories have you been told? And what conditioning have you received in your nervous system to responses of racial and caste stress? And that, again, is a very, very key offering that comes from mindfulness, because we are not our conditions. I might be angry, but I am not anger. And I think that being able to do that and have those levels of non-attachment allow you to be more nimble in the face of your current conditioning, and give you the pathway to freeing yourself from that suffering, whether it's that of white supremacy or of brahmanism. So to me, this pathway of understanding things through the soul wound helped me not only have empathy for myself, because I was not recognizing my own pain, Rima, which is very common for BIPOC women, but I also was trying to understand the illogic of the privilege. And, whether you're seeing, white parents melt down in school boards saying that the teaching of slavery is going to lead to their white children being traumatized, and Black authors being banned, and this like incredible violent blowback against affirmative action and critical race theory. Right. When, we see those same things in terms of the caste struggle. And I always remember when I was deplatformed at Google by dominant caste bigots, they said this thing where they said, if this person speaks, I'm afraid for my life. And I was so struck by that, because I was like, well, as far as I know, no one has ever died from a DEI talk. You could tell me differently, Rima, but I'm pretty sure that's not a thing. But the fact that the bodies of a privileged caste person went to a survival level message in their nervous system at the prospect of caste equity, and even just hearing a Dalit person talk about their experience tells you the lack of resilience they have towards being in caste stress. Yeah. And so these techniques of mindfulness, and especially as pioneered by Black Buddhists to provide interventions on the racist mind and the white supremacist body, are so useful in the context of caste and other hegemonic systems, because you're not using mindfulness and non-attachment again in some airy-fairy way. It's actually about how do we practically remove ourselves from our suffering and have self-awareness of our conditioning related to systems of exclusion. And so that's, again, one of the deep benefits and, gifts that the Black Buddhist tradition has given so many movements. And it's a sign of why Black Buddhists are part of a longer tradition of Black internationalism. So it's so moving for me, and it's moved thousands of people in our Unlearning Caste Supremacy workshops. And that's a direct, direct descendant of that beautiful lineage and work.
So beautiful. And I'm so struck by the meaning that this lineage of Black Buddhists has had the world over. I've actually heard that from different quarters, and it's been so striking. And yet, because of my own experience, I understand that depth absolutely and feel such deep gratitude myself. And two things stand out in all that you're saying. And one is, I'm thinking of James Baldwin's words in The Fire Next Time, in which he talks about how Black people have operated as a fixed star for white people, so that to move the star would just like shake the foundations in ways that white people aren't ready to deal with. So when you speak of the kind of fragility, for example, what happened at Google, and being encountering that language of survival being threatened, and just thinking about how Baldwin read white supremacy, and what Baldwin argued is, there's all of this denial, this avoidance, this projection that white people have sought to avoid suffering, including the fact of death. Something I actually found so powerful about Buddhism is, the fact of impermanence, including the fact of death. But if we operate in a system in which we're always avoiding suffering and the fact of death, the knee-jerk reaction is that the people who are in positions of power will deny and avoid and project. So all of that was projected onto Black bodies. And if the Black bodies aren't in this subservient state to receive that avoidance, including fear, including hatred, what happens to those nervous systems? And what Baldwin also says, and I teach this class, The Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde, and we do this deep dive into Baldwin, including The Fire Next Time. We actually read this one passage over 3 classes again and again, but he says, we turn to our suffering, we walk through it, and in so doing, we achieve a kind of unshakable inner authority. We achieve this capacity, this stamina, and that is what I hold on to. And that is what I feel practice gives us. It gives us this stamina, this capacity to turn towards what is all of the suffering. And for me, as I was saying with the compassion practices, being resourced so that we can take on what is and face it, so that we're doing exactly what the dominant culture, in your case, in terms of the work you're doing, caste oppression, and of course, it's all part of this larger system of supremacist thinking. But if we can turn towards that, but not replicate, right? Like operate really differently so that we can see clearly, but with this kind of inner authority, and refuse to project, refuse to avoid, refuse to deny or to repress. We just have this capacity to turn towards it and see it. I do feel like so much of what has been internalized will be undone within us. And I also think as we move forward, we don't then replicate the harm. That is what I would say I seek in my own practice, in my way of being in the world, in my activism, to take it on, to see it clearly, to offer this breadth of approach, but not to do harm, not to replicate these patterns of harm. And that's hard work in and of itself. That is hard work.
It is hard work and a life's work. But
it's a life's work.
But I think one of the things I'm struck by what you're saying is how very few things in supremacist society train you for being able to have the capacity to sit with the full view of your suffering.
Mm.
And that's where I think Buddhist training is so powerful, because again, that's why I wrote this book, was that I knew it was time to begin integration. And I probably wasn't mature enough as a spirit to be able to do that. But I think that the thing I'm challenged by is that it's like when you are struggling with integration, for me, that I really had to, there's work that only you can do, and there's work that you can do collectively with other people.
Mm.
And I feel like part of what I was trying to do with this book was provide a path for caste oppressed people to allow themselves to feel the things that don't get seen when you have to practice respectability politics. And for folks that have never heard that term, like at least the way that we're using it, it's like you want to show your best version of yourself. So I know, Rima, you've been reading a lot of Dr. Ambedkar. And for him, like part of, especially as a figure that came in modernity, he didn't want to show the downtrodden Dalit. He wanted to be always in a suit, and everything was pressed and clean and prepared. And even if even if you only had one suit, that suit was properly cleaned. And you want to talk about your achievements. You want to talk about how we are doing all the great things. And yes, caste oppressed people are making strides despite massive dehumanization, but in the inside, we're crumbling. Because we don't have a meaningful conversation about mental health in our community. So we have high rates of suicide. We have people suffering. You cannot live this level of dehumanization and mass atrocity and not have our family structures implode, not have people, conducting themselves in abusive ways with each other. There's just needs to be more scaffolding for our pain.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I think we're seeing such a transformative moment, with Black Somatic abolitionist work. And, there's work that we're doing in Equality Labs to introduce Dalit Feminist Somatic abolitionist practices in order to try to create that scaffolding. Is that healing, if it's not part of the process, we're basically just replicating supremacist systems. Because again, we cannot take this on individually, and we cannot, there's no place in this society where we beat back white supremacy and brahmanism and we're not centering our healing. If we really take back these systems, we have to address our intergenerational pain. We have to address our current pain as well, So writing this book was both a way of making Dalit people be seen, and for the world to better know how to be in solidarity with our movements, and also for Dalit people to feel comfortable to reach out in solidarity. Because some of the Dalit people reading this book may not know about these amazing lineages, that we have connections and historical things. So it's really meant to be a really beautiful, empathetic bridge at a time when we need collective strategies for solidarity.
I really hear that. I hear you saying we can do our own work, and yet we need each other. We have to do this together. And I absolutely affirm that and feel that. And also just want to echo everything you're saying about the healing work as part of the systemic work and confronting systemic oppression. And I will honestly say that is the fundamental argument that Black Buddhists and the Black radical tradition makes, that yes, dismantle the penal system. Yes, confront gender oppression. Yes, and we have to do our own work. We have to step back and take time. We have to see our own conditioning. We're taking on these external conditions, but we have to see our own inner conditioning as well. And that is just as much movement work as taking on the external conditions and dismantling them, just as much. And on some level, I think this practice, what we are doing in practice, is rewiring, right? And giving ourselves some spaciousness. And that community aspect that you talk about, that's the mirroring. We need to be mirrored as well. We need each other. And so to be able to do the collective work, both in terms of dismantling oppressive conditions, but also sitting together and being in community together and really being tender with one another, is just as much, just as important, not to, create some kind of hierarchy around what's important, as much as to say valuing our inner lives and valuing our collective spaces is foundational and will sustain us after we've dismantled the structures, right? As we seek to put something new in place. And we haven't discussed what the word abolition means, but myself, being steeped in the work of Angela Davis and, having taught essentially a class with her theories at the core, a class on the penal system, I think it's worth saying that for Angela Davis, as she uses this term prison abolition so intentionally, she's saying, yes, take down the penal system as it operates to supplant all of the work of caring, of supporting, of essentially respecting human beings, especially those who are really struggling and who are at the margins, rather than incarcerating them. But we've used the penal system to address all of these social ills. So she says, yes, stop building and take them down. But as we do so, we're seeking to build up community organizations. And it's not what's in its place. It's how do we actually turn our attention in this other direction and build up these community organizations. And what I keep thinking about is, as we build these community organizations, how do we honor the social and emotional lives of ourselves as people on the ground, and also the people with whom we're working, right? It's childcare, practically, right? It's employment, it's housing, and it's also all of the social and emotional work that comes along with healing. And so I think this term abolition is a very powerful term. And yet so often when we hear it, we think abolish or dismantle or, tear something apart, but really it suggests this other orientation. And I think we don't hear that, or we don't know that in such a deep way. But it points to what you are talking about in terms of how much we need community.
Well, and it's really interesting because, I use the term caste abolition and I reference it in my book. And it's not necessarily a term that's used very frequently in South Asian contexts. In fact, the way, you've just read Dr. Ambedkar's work, that we actually use the term annihilate caste.
Annihilation, right?
Yes. But that term does not really translate into an American context. It actually makes it even seem like sci-fi, like someone's like, is there alien involved? Why are we annihilating something,
Right.
So, but for me, I felt like abolition was really apropos to talk about caste. First, because of the cycle of carcerality that is set up in dharmic lineages, especially those that have karma and dharma connected to them. Because, for Dalits, because of what they say about what we've done in our karma in our last lives, our life in this time is meant to be a sentence. It's a punishment, and you can't get out of it, because then you're actually violating your duty, your dharma, by doing that. And I just thought that's so absurd. Wow. Why, they basically have created a spiritual sanction for oppression, and also that if we don't do it, we're going to be punished again. And that is the definition of carcerality, right? So for me, I learned about abolition and really thought about abolition in the caste context from the writings of Jyotibai Phule, who has this really beautiful book, Gulamgari. And he wrote it because he was inspired about the slavery abolitionist movement. And he was writing this as an ode to those activists, and also thinking in himself about what he had seen in his own suffering as a caste oppressed person and all of his people. And that, the suffering of what people were enduring was enough to make the rocks weep and the land to share your grief. And that's, to me, what opened my heart, that I was like, we must use the term abolition, because it really also makes people understand this is not like, when people use the term caste system, it makes it sound like it's in history and it's like something sociological, but not violent. But, there was slavery, and there still is slavery when it comes to caste. There is vicious, disgusting, backbreaking, dehumanizing things that are happening every day. And I think we should not shy away from that reality. And I think abolition forces us to look at what are the crimes happening in the name of our safety or in the name of what we think is, common society, and what is it that we want to free ourselves from? And I want to be freed of caste, just like I want to be freed of white supremacy in the prison industrial complex. And, if we talk about the prison system in South Asia, its carceral systems and its targeted bodies are Black and are Dalit and religious minorities. So you see that, every dominant class of people has set up a prison system to penalize and to exploit the labor of the most oppressed. And so if we oppose prisons in one region, we must oppose them in all.
Now, I hear that, and I am so struck by this language of punishment that is persistent across borders in different regions, and so struck by how punishment is embedded in all aspects of life when we have these stark hierarchies in terms of how those punishment systems are directed towards those who are most marginalized or most oppressed, most unseen. And I know this is a leap, and please bear with me, but I'm going to circle back to the very first part of our conversation and all of that grief work. And one of the epiphanies around that grief work, and now this is the leap, my own practice as a parent is in recognizing that if I did not have an approach of relationship, of care that was just foundational, the deeper work of connecting, then any kind of, let's just say, I know this is very Foucauldian, but correction, for lack of a better, let's say guidance, right? Guidance for my kids and the kids who, will do all matters of things. But if I didn't have that deeper connection and relationship, any kind of guidance really did smack on punishment. It really did smack on a kind of harshness, a kind of landing on. And some of that grief work meant I had to really reorient. And, a Zen teacher once said, the way you treat yourself is the way you treat the world. And so thinking about punishment and thinking now about systems of punishment, if all we do is punish, if we create punishment and embed them in our education systems and our labor systems, of course, as you were referencing, in our penal systems, and we are landing on people, we are essentially writing off whole populations. And what the work is, I feel now, and I'm thinking of Ambedkar and just his care and concern for laborers and for women and for students, to reorient so that rather than landing on and sanctioning, we are reorienting towards connection. And how do we do this in a mass way? That's really the question I have. How do we take these orientations we have in the most personal ways and expand them into systems? But I believe it's possible. I'm so inspired by, reading about Ambedkar in the 1920s and, the symbolic satyagrahas and the symbolic challenges, but also legislatively to think, how do we support those who do not have access? How do we support those who are most oppressed? I'm thinking about that right now with the housing crisis in this country. I'm thinking, I'm reading articles every day and just feeling so confronted and thinking, all of the comments for these particular articles are like, we tore down the mental health institutions, we need to bring them back. And I just think, no, what is a compassionate way to respond? How do we actually do this in a way that we're not just sanctioning and penalizing and coming down on whole populations, but really building in, as Angela Davis would say, these community organizations in which we have this embedded approach of compassion? These are my huge questions right now. I think Ambedkar and then reading the New York Times alongside each other, like, how do we do this? How do we do this? I'm seeking inspiration even as I talk, but I believe that it's possible.
Well, I think systems like race and systems like caste operate in so many domains. And, for folks who don't know Dr. Ambedkar, we've been referencing him throughout this conversation. He was the architect of the Indian Constitution, and was kind of our Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and in a weird way, but not an oppressive way, our Thomas Jefferson, because he was that jurisprudence person who helped to write our Constitution. But he also was a very thoughtful philosopher and trying to find every terrain that caste existed and then have some sort of tactical strategy around it. And I think that goes to your question, Rima, is that these systems are so big. It's like, well, do we need to be a policymaker? Do we need to be a mental health practitioner? Do we need to be a social worker? Do we need to be a philanthropist? Do we need to be, an activist on the ground? And what Dr. Ambedkar did was like, he did all of it. And then at the end, he converted to Buddhism, because he felt like there was also needed to be, when you live in a system of religious abuse, you have to have a path that gives you the tools to, corral your morale and your spirit, and not return back to a place of superstition and violence. So he even went in that direction, right? So I think that that's a big part of why in my book I talk about the just transition, so that we can be kind to ourselves. No one is expecting us to like wake up tomorrow and be like, we're going to solve it all. And here's this one project done. It takes lifetimes to create the kinds of violent systems that we're enduring. So it'll take lifetimes to create what comes next. But part of what we need in terms of an internal shift is for us to give ourselves permission to move away from rapid response, from being firefighters, and to become architects. Architects of that new path. And in some ways, it means that we also have to have different kinds of investments, different kinds of priorities, where we're able to start to experiment in building the different components of the just transition that might be applicable for us as we try to both take apart carceral systems, Brahminical systems, white supremacy, environmental racism, and casteism, and then look at new business models, look at new forms of societal organization where we can reassert consent, reassert choice, reassert possibility and empathy and love to those systems. And that feels like a big picture assignment, and it's meant to be, it's meant to be a life's work and many generations' work. But it's also about us realigning ourselves from defensive positions into visionary positions. And I think that's very, very hard. But I remember doing this fellowship with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and they have this model called Build Block B. Have you gone through that?
I've been on a retreat, yes.
So Rima, I saw the Build Block B circles while I was protesting the inauguration of Donald Trump. So that I was in the middle of a blocking strategy, and there was like a Black Somatic healer that was in the training zone, and he had just printed out images of the Build Block B circle, and it was just like randomly everywhere. And I picked it up. And again, it was like another bell in my spirit, because I was like, I know how to block. I know how to resist. I know how to fight. But do I know how to heal? Do I know how to grow? Do I know how to construct? And, and I do, because obviously the people who've been fighting the things that are wrong know very intimately what doesn't work. Those are the best people to put as solution builders, but we're rarely given that opportunity because architects don't always look like us. Architects don't always look like people who come from and have lived oppressed lineages. But we don't need anybody else's permission to be dreamers, to be visionaries, to be healers. We just need to claim that ring of power. And that is also part of our healing.
Yes. And, I mentioned this class, The Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde, and quoted Baldwin, but the voice actually that echoes all of what you're saying is Audre Lorde's voice, where she just talks about dreaming and she talks about imagining, and, she holds in front of her that we we have that power. She uses that term very deliberately. And so I listen to you and I hear Audre Lorde's voice. And I love that we're referencing our ancestors, our spiritual ancestors in this conversation, because I do feel like I stand on many, many shoulders, and also do need to be reminded, that in these conditions we've been given, we're so often taking on what's handed to us, but we need to create that spaciousness to step outside, right? And, for me, for example, a lot of that happens in nature, just like the sense of, okay, there's more than the conditions I am witnessing in my immediate environment. And yes, reading and thinking, I think Ambedkar in part was so motivated and because he had all of these voices in the backdrop, and was could hear that there are ways of moving forward that were not necessarily in his immediate environment. So as I've been reading this particular biography and reading his primary works, just thinking about all of these influences and what I too draw upon, that visioning, that imagining, that dreaming, as you say, and how important it is to keep that at the forefront, to tap into that and to access that, and also to rest when necessary. I think, when you were talking about the fact that we need to give ourselves permission and not wait for someone else to give us permission, for me, a lot of that happens with rest, and we don't really dream if we don't sleep, right? So we have to be able to restore. That is, I think, my fundamental message when I'm teaching, even in the classroom, is just to create that spaciousness for restoration so that we don't burn out, we don't go through those cycles of burnout, and also we don't get stuck, right? We don't just kind of see what's handed to us and think that's all there is, but we can step into a kind of spaciousness and expansiveness and dream, as you say.
Yes, and it's, it can feel very difficult to prioritize a pause. Not everyone can afford a rest, but almost everyone can afford a pause, And sometimes for me, it's almost like in any given day, as a Dalit or Black or oppressed person, you could have 100 microaggressions, an extreme act of violence, and you're still expect to keep it moving. And I think we make logical choices. We're like, something bad happened to me, let me shove it down. Oh no, that is terrible on the TV, let me shove it down. Oh my gosh, like I can't go there because there's something bad, let me shove it down. That kind of consistent, persistent shoving down, where we're erasing the experience of embodied trauma, that's where the restoration is so helpful, because even if it's just a pause to let the trauma like finish its cycle, where you're like, oh, I feel terrible, I feel it in my gut, oh, I need care, and then you breathe it out. Even something as small as that can help, versus like just letting it kind of grow like an emotional landfill inside of you. That's actually what leads to so many somatic conditions that we see our people struggle with, whether it's heart attacks or blood pressure or other diseases that are informed by oxidative stress, so and I this message was really, really brought home to me when I started writing this book, because not only was it this whole arc of, I started writing this book at the opening of a genocide, then into a pandemic, then the uprising and the coup, and that got us to 2021, right? We're still like 2 years even out from all of those big structural moments. But also my mom became terminal, and I watched her fight for her life. And I always remember the first time I stepped into a dialysis center. And for anyone that has ever had anybody with kidney disease, it's a disease that ravages your body. And, the conditions that lead to it are, somatized diseases like high blood pressure and diabetes. So everyone in those centers are Black and brown elders, bus drivers, they're nurses, they're social workers, people whose bodies have held up our society, but we've discarded them because they're no longer valuable or useful. And the way elders were treated in that moment just broke my heart. And then I saw, if we don't remedy how we manage and create pauses or restoration in the ways that we have to hold this tremendous violent system that was created by many people. So why are we holding it up with just our individual body? It will just be a continuous way that we pass on, these health conditions, down the generational line. So I want to break those generational curses. And some of it is by bringing attention to how can we relieve and bring ease and empathetic, witness to the pain we carry. And then also use that energy for us to ground ourselves and commit ourselves to removing these systems in our lifetime.
Yeah. I hear that in a deep way. And it does, again, reverberate on the earlier part of our conversation of doing the work, but doing it differently. And it's both immediate and it is the long haul work.
Yes.
So I am mindful of the fact that we're past 8 o'clock, and I would love to open up our conversation to our audience. And there have been a couple of things in the chat. And Peace, I think my understanding is you'll help us with this conversation a bit. If anybody wants to raise their hand or put something in the chat.
Yeah, and I'll just read one here that's been put in the Q&A box. Could you elaborate a bit more on Black Somatic abolition? What is that?
Sure. I mean, and Rima, I don't know if you want to take this question as well, but the way that I understand it, it's like a tradition that you're seeing many different healers who are serving movements and Black communities who are thinking about different ways to bring embodied understandings of both how Black bodies have experienced violence and also how it shaped the way that they show up in the world, and also techniques for managing that pain and reintegrating and creating new contracts with them, with their bodies, with other folks and the earth. And I think of Prentice Hemphill as part of this tradition. I think of Adrienne Marie Brown, who was the person who actually first introduced this work to me, Adaku, Utah, as part of this work, and also Resmaa Menakem. And there's many, many, many more people, but it is about looking at the ways that we try to create healing modalities that look at systems of oppression and also creating ways for us to operate differently around that violence.
Yes, I think that is beautifully said. I'm most familiar with Resmaa Menakem's work, but I also know Prentice Hemphill's work and Adrienne Marie Brown's work, and Stacy Hines is one of the first people to really lean into somatics within social justice work, and has written a book that is not at the tip of my tongue, but if you remember it, maybe we can put it in the chat.
The Politics of Trauma. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to put that in.
What's so funny, Rima, is that when Adrienne first talked to me about somatics, I was so resistant. I shut it down. And that was because I thought that it was going to reintroduce a dharmic practice into movement spaces. And I told her, I feel so scared hearing you talk about this, because when caste oppressed people enter movement spaces or educational spaces and people are invoking dharmic lineages without a caste equity acknowledgement, we worry about a space being, set up where we're not going to be able to participate because it's exclusive, and there is this thing, I think, with people who practice, and benefit from dharmic lineages, like recognizing that these lineages can bring you benefit, but have been rooted in centuries of violence and harm, just like we do in land acknowledgement, making that caste equity acknowledgement was really powerful. And at the time I didn't have any of that language, but I just told her I was terrified. And then she's like, yeah, let's talk about it. And then we talked about it. We talked about how the body is mapped in certain ways within Dharmic traditions that has helped illuminate, some of those mind-body connections for people around the world. But certainly in the Black Somatic tradition, they've moved that and also mixed it with other indigenous Black traditions like conjure and other things that make it very specifically their own thing. But that said, recognizing that using terms that have Sanskrit origin, I remember asking Stacy, like, does somatics refer to, soma, like the Sanskrit? And she's like, no, it actually comes from the Greek. But hearing that trepidation and the pain and the fear that's behind that question was really illuminating for all those folks, because again, when you don't have caste oppressed people talking about our experience, we don't understand how spiritual systems, which do give benefit to people, are also systems that are human, also have things that have attachment with them and have caused harm. To talk about that is not to take away your benefit. It's simply to acknowledge that there were humans that made this. So let's talk about that pain so we can move on from it.
Acknowledging.
Thank you for that. Yeah, another question is kind of to build from that. This question says, how might students at Union or others perhaps support the work of caste abolition in healing the soul wound?
Well, I love this question, and I have very practical answers for you. So one, if Union Theological Seminary were to add caste as a protected category, that would be an enormous thing, because we are in this civil rights movement where caste oppressed people around the world are asking for the recognition of the discrimination that we endure, and for institutions to become welcome for all by the addition of caste anywhere that non-discrimination protected classes are listed in your policy. So if that's something students or faculty or everyone would like to work on, that would be one really amazing thing. And Professor Cornell West has worked on many of these campaigns with our team. And so he would be another ally. I'm sure you guys could tap in that journey if you were so interested. The other thing is that if you are hosting any sort of a dharmic space or dharmic tradition or course, having a caste equity acknowledgement would also be another way to kind of bring attention to, the harm that's at the root of these traditions, as well as the opening and solidarity with caste oppressed people as they fight for their freedom around the world. And I have a little blurb that I can send you guys that would be a really good example of that. Also celebrating things like Dalit History Month and the contributions of Dalit people. We are more than our violence that we've endured, and there's so many interesting and fascinating and valuable contributions that caste oppressed people have made to world history, and celebrating that is really an amazing way to make sure that we're incorporated into the rest of your community at the university and beyond.
Thank you.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you so much. This question says, I'm curious about your thoughts on Isabel Wilkerson's work on caste and what seems like an expansion of what it is.
Well, I think that, there's a lot of people that have a lot of feelings about Isabel Wilkerson's book. And I think that everyone is entitled to their feelings. And I also think that Isabel is entitled to write about whatever she damn well wants. And I think that very few times do we get to have, Black and Dalit scholars comment about global things without some sort of, interference about what should or should not be told. And what I've appreciated about her work was that she, as an oppressed person, wanted to create a comparative framework that would help understand anti-Blackness across multiple systems of hierarchy. And I think that book does that job really, really well. And I'm really glad that it exists. And I know that there are Black folks that are upset with her conflating race and caste, that really are like, race is race. We need to stay in our lane. Don't do that. And there are also Dalit folks that are like, caste is caste. We don't need all that. Just let us be here. And those are great opinions to have, and people should have all the opinions. I think all oppressed people should theorize their own experiences, and I'm glad for that. I think Isabel gets to write whatever she damn well wants. And I have benefited from her writing. And I also think that there is room for multiple opinions about it. And all of that is okay. But I will say what's really interesting about what Isabel did is not unlike what I did in terms of the context of caste. I was hungry for language to explain the dimensions of what I saw in my own experience. And my elders who helped me with that were other BIPOC women of color who were elders, and the work of people like Patricia Hill Collins and, Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks were so informative and transformative in that regard. This is the path. So to that end, I really encourage people reading Isabel Wilkerson's book. I think you could read my book and her book and Rima's book in a really interesting comparative frame. And I think all of it will give you insight into the conditions of what it means to be oppressed and also what are pathways for liberation. But you don't have to take any one book as the definitive articulation of what it means to be Black and what it means to be Dalit. We are not a monolith. We are so infinite, just like the experience of life. And so I would take it with that.
I think in the interest of time, I won't say much, but one quick thing that I'll say is it's important as we hear this term caste, but maybe don't have a breadth of understanding of what it is or how it operates, or, the same way that we have references to race and racism, but maybe don't have this long history or long understanding, to just take into account, and this is, of course, a very Buddhist approach, but nothing is fixed. And what I appreciate about that book and the challenges that she's seeking to articulate is this challenge is something that seems fixed, but we have to find ways to understand how it can be dismantled, how it can be shifted and changed. So I'll just stop there, but I do understand that as part of her orientation,
Absolutely.
especially in a post-2016 political climate.
Are there other questions, or Rima, other thoughts that you're having?
Are there other questions?
Yeah, I have a two-parter here,
Okay.
and I'll read it. It says, as someone who was raised by parents practicing corporal punishment, how do you heal and cultivate compassion for people who have or will abuse us? So that's part one. And the second part is, how do we create healthy boundaries and balance with people who have experienced intense harm while offering them support?
That's a good question. Rima, I'm really curious how you would answer this. But I think in terms of having compassion for your oppressors or people that have caused you harm, I think it's something that is not about parallel processes, it's about consecutive processes. So I think you need to be able to first put on your own oxygen mask and also understand your own pain and metabolize it in order for it to not be so immediate and so much of a live wire, in order for you then to be able to have empathy for those that have harmed you. When you try to do both at the same time, it's not helpful, and you're not able to do either one fully. So then you have the trauma response still kind of stuck, So I kind of look at address your pain first, really metabolize it, and then think about and offer, if possible, empathetic witness to those that have harmed you. And I do that in my own life, especially with a lot of the bigots that I have to face, because I have I face routinely rape threats and death threats and other forms of physical violence for my work. And there are days where you just want to just break down and cry, or it just feels like, again, really, we're back in this terrible moment. But this is also the struggle of the human condition. Like thinking about it with the Buddhist lens is that every time you see the flow of the species to progress, there are also forces that want to drive us back down to diminishment and to, unprocessed trauma and violence and energy. And how we meet those moments of challenge with, grace and dignity and intelligence is really the test of our mettle as a person and as a human. And I feel like going back to that metaphor, Rima, you talked about going in, that James Baldwin talked about in terms of being so purified by being present in your suffering. I think that you learn a lot about how to create that container for your own metabolizing of your pain. And once you've done that, you can look upon your oppressor with awareness. And you don't have to, I'm not saying that you have to love them, but I oftentimes think about the conditions of what created them and provide empathy. So when I do my loving kindness meditation, I offer love to those who are harming me, because even that act of what they want to do comes from some wound they have. Even if they can't articulate it, they're behaving badly because of that. And so it's a thing that needs to happen, that is hopeful. I would hope that occurs. And then I think on the question of boundaries, I think boundaries are a form of practice. You don't always get it right, but if you can basically start to look at consent, like, are you able to really hold what you're engaging in? That's a different question than I have to act. Someone just like talk to me, I have to do something. And that's where Ruth King's Mindful of Race is really helpful, because she has that whole RAIN practice where it's like you have an experience. Instead of acting, you have 2 steps beforehand, which are about acknowledging it, recognizing you're not the same as your trigger, and then having some investigation as to like, well, what makes me think things? And do I have to act? Can I just offer care instead of action? Or what is the action if I look at it through the lens of care versus like my traditional action around this, which might be fight or flee or freeze? And so I think those are things that kind of help you make different decisions about boundaries. And then the more you do it, the better you get, Rima, I'm curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's very much a part of my upbringing in terms of suffering from harm from particularly one parent, another who was totally absent. I write about this actually in the introduction to my book, some of my own story and what brought me to Buddhist practice. But it's a lot of work to turn towards the harm a parent has created and both acknowledge the depth of that and the trauma it's created, and also to see our knee-jerk responses are there's this Pali term sankhara, which refers to mental formations, these habitual formations, and we respond to our conditions in certain ways. It's hard to see those conditions, but if we cultivate this capacity for insight, we can see that. And going back to what I said early on in this conversation, being able to create some compassion, some self-compassion, so that all of it has a place to land as you're turning towards it, is so fruitful. And I'm writing about this, right? It's actually extremely hard, but I'm writing about my relationship with my family right now as I'm writing a new book on Dharma and James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. And Baldwin, in some of his earliest essays, talks about his stepfather, who was extremely abusive in multiple ways, and how after his stepfather's death and much later, he could see his stepfather suffering, the conditions his stepfather confronted. And he also knew that he did not want to replicate that hatred in his life. And so he was able to kind of step back and cultivate some compassion for both of them. But the reason Baldwin is so formative for me, but the reason actually I think Audre Lorde's voice is so poignant and so stark. I sometimes feel like she sits on my shoulder in meditation practice. It's because she has this essay called Eye to Eye, and it's about Black women and hatred. And she has this one passage in there where she talks about how we have to mother ourselves. And I read this and then I underlined, and I went back, I underlined probably 3/4, 2/3 of this essay are underlined, but that passage, we have to mother ourselves, was so important in my own cultivation. And when I spoke early on about that maternal voice, it really comes from that work. So as we're dealing with the harm created by parents, having this ability to start with compassionate approaches. And now I'm a parent, and definitely the acknowledgement that I have created harm, especially for one of my children when I was not very well resourced, it's so heartbreaking. And so I understand that a lot of my work as a parent is just the work I do on myself, and starting with those compassion practices. And it's rare these days that I'm in reactive mode. I'm much more internally stable, but it does involve cultivation. And I think having these voices, having references, I was just actually listening to Jan Willis, who's a Black Tibetan scholar, speak. It was maybe about a week and a half ago, and she talked about in the Tantra tradition, having visualizations. I think whatever resources we have that help us meet our suffering, it's absolutely worth investing in those resources. And it will do some of that deeper healing work, especially when it comes to how we've been parented. And the other thing I'll just say very briefly with regards to boundaries is when I am in a situation in which I need to create boundaries, I rarely cut off relationships, but I do build in safety. And usually that involves having other people in conversations so that I'm not taking all of it on. So I just offer that as more strategic than anything.
And I think that example you gave about reckoning, where you were thinking about you had potentially caused harm to your child and what that felt like, I think that's a microcosm of what it means for people who have been in the bodies of the privilege to similarly reflect on the ways that they have inflicted harm on racially oppressed and caste oppressed people. Just that one incident was enough to really just shake you to your core. Imagine if you have lifetimes in your lineage and in your own practice, you've done that. The terror of confronting that is tremendous. Yeah. And that's really why you need Black Somatic abolitionist practices and Black Buddhist practices to address these systems of race. And hopefully, within the Dalit tradition, we will be building these things, for caste reconciliation. That's where I bring empathy for those that have caused harm for me, because we've all caused harm, We've not all of, there's no one situation where you're like always oppressed all the time. We all have made mistakes, but there is so much shame and guilt for acknowledging where we've caused harm. But I always think about, that the story of Ananda and how it was really, he really wanted to, get nirvana. And it was only after the Buddha died that he faced tremendous grief that he was able to achieve enlightenment. And these things that we've shoved away in terms of shame and pain and guilt of complicity, or even as perpetrators, when we can sit with it, we can metabolize it and make meaning of it. And then that's how we ensure that we don't pass on the harm. And it feels raw. It feels difficult, because it is. But when you do that, there's such a freeing thing, because that experience no longer defines you, and that's why I always say you lose your privilege, but you gain your humanity and you gain your kin. And that's a tremendous thing to experience.
Beautifully said.
Maybe one last question to close. And this is, do you, either or one of you, have an example of a somatic practice that you use when you're exhausted by prejudice and discrimination?
Mm.
You know, there is exercises in my book, which I think are really helpful. There's one where you connect to your child, which I really love, and one where you connect to your ancestors. And for me, my ancestors are my deepest reservoir of strength. And I actually had to really do work to connect with them, because as a Dalit person, you're told not to. You're taught not to have the spiritual domain. So I had to really break through all of these binds to say, my ancestors are my right. Go away, everybody. And you know, and Ruth King's work was very valuable for that, because she builds ancestral practice very deeply in her work, as does Resmaa Menakem. And for me, I think that being able to create moments of commune in that regard, moments of, like, for me, moments of rest aren't just about sleeping. They're about rest even away from this modern point of time. They're about being able to be expansive and to sit and think deeply with my lineage, you know, those that come after me and those that come before, which, you know, could sound a little corny to people, but actually that's really what I do. Like, it just was really important to me to have space where I witnessed my ancestors' pain and also cherish them and love them and care for them. And in doing so, I find a part of myself healed, because it's the part of me that was never nourished and loved and cared for that comes out of that, you know? So that really helps me quite a bit.
Mm. Yeah. For me, and actually, this conversation is such a good reminder, but I do feel like moving, and thinking of somatic practices, that something that doesn't come easily. I can be very intellectual and very internal. So just actually like a practice of walking in the woods, a practice of dancing to the beat of drums, you know, a way of kind of channeling energy is really important. I do sit still a lot. I actually have gained such great value in still sitting, and because, and of course, I spent hours at the computer. I'm reading, I'm writing, I'm doing this, I'm teaching online. But this practice of moving and channeling energy. So hiking is a big thing. Mountain biking is a somatic practice. I just getting out there, feeling the sun on my face, hearing water if I'm on a path that's next to a stream. And what this conversation is really reminding me of is the importance of dancing, and you know, just in a very unself-conscious way. Just I can tell actually where I'm at in my life if I give myself space to dance, and I can just kind of let go of this external eye, and you know, kind of like a sense of being evaluated, and just be in my body. And I'm also very conscious that everything I'm naming is an able-bodied practice. So I also want to offer that really tuning into what your body needs. And, you know, there are many different capacities, just what your body has capacity for and what gives you joy. That to me is like just the best kind of somatic practice, tapping into joy. And maybe that's a great way to conclude, because we haven't talked directly about joy. You've talked so much about suffering, but just making space for joy and connection and being in the body is, I think, so important. And, you know, there's this phrase, something like Black joy is Black resistance, or, you know, something to that effect. And I think, yes, you know, not just always being in this mode of facing or confronting, but also just tapping into these other energies in life, erotic energy. It's so important.
Oh, definitely. And it's funny because, you know, there is a lot of humor in my book. And it was, I think that, you know, I always think I have like another life where I was a stand-up comedian, because I do love, you know, the way that humor both is incisive and that heals. And, but I think that feeling joyful and and the irresistibility of that joy in the face of those that dehumanize us, it drives them mad because they want you to be downtrodden. They want you to be crushed. And here you are growing like a flower. And it's just like you are unafraid, unapologetic, and alive and magical. And at the points where, the hardest parts of your day, when you can turn on that joy. And for me, usually that comes from family, whether it's being around like the younger children in my family or being around my elders. They always see you when the world sees you in a terrible way. They always give you back to yourself, and that's what I love. And so anchoring in that joy and also hugging a tree, I was listening. That sounds, again, super corny, but I can't tell you how many trees I've cried on and they've held it and then they return it back to you. And then you just feel happy because you're in the presence of other species that also care about life,
Yes. I hear Alice Walker in your words. Well, I'm conscious we're at time and peace. Didn't know if you want to say anything else, but I know we are actually a little bit past time.
No. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, peace.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you both for this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your work and your conversation here tonight. It was really a gift and at least leaves me with plenty of things to consider in moving forward. And so just to hand it back to you, both of you, for any closing words.
Well, Thenmozhi, it's my honor and deep, deep joy, to speak of joy, to have had this opportunity to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much for your presence and your practice and your work, your hard work. I know tomorrow's a huge day for you as you take on the state of California, and I send you great energy and blessings and gratitude for your work.
Oh, thank you so much, Rima. And for folks that are wondering, what is Rima talking about, is that we are actually launching a bill to add caste as a protected category in California. And so the scoop is here, guys. But if you want to catch it, we will have the press conference live stream on our Instagram at Equality Labs. But this is a many-month campaign, so you'll be hearing lots about it from us. But, just know that I send you love and loving kindness to all of y'all. And thank you for sharing space with me and Rima, for your thoughtfulness and care in terms of moderating and participating in conversation. Your work is so inspirational to me, and it was just wonderful to be in kinship with you, and look forward to the next time.
Yes, to the next time.
Jai Bhim and Jai Savitri, everyone. You take care. Bye-bye.